Listen closely to this sound, the thud of a naval gun, the scream of a shell, and then nothing. A clean miss. In the early years of World War II, anti-aircraft crews lived with that silence. They could fill the sky with steel and smoke and still watch an enemy plane slip through untouched. Dive bombers twisted at the last second, torpedo planes skimmed low, and fighters came fast and erratic. If your shell didn't hit the plane or explode at exactly the right moment, it did almost nothing. Near misses were heartbreak. You saw the flashes bloom in the wrong place, felt the deck shake under your feet, and knew the target was still coming. Now imagine a different outcome. Imagine a small device inside the nose of that shell, a tiny radio brain that senses when it is right beside the target and chooses that perfect instant to detonate. Suddenly, near misses become lethal. Suddenly, the odds swing. In this episode, we tell the story of that device, the radar proximity fuse, known by the bland code name VT. We will see why anti-aircraft gunners needed it, how scientists built it under brutal constraints, how it passed its first tests, and how it drew first blood in the Solomon Islands, while the Allies hid it behind layers of secrecy. And by the end, we'll hold a simple question in our hands. If VT could swat agile dive bombers at sea, what would happen when London faced pilotless missiles coming in waves at 400 miles an hour? Before VT, gunners had two basic options: a contact fuse that exploded only if the shell hit the aircraft, rare against a fast, maneuvering target, or a time fuse. You dial an expected burst time before firing, hoping the shell will explode at the same place and moment as the plane. On a calm range day, that could work. In real combat, it was guesswork against speed, altitude changes, crosswinds, and human error. The closer a plane came, the more dramatic its motion looked through a sight. At high angles or low passes, a fraction of a second meant the difference between dead air and a hit. Crews fired bravely and often, but the geometry was cruel. The enemy only had to slip the timing by a little. The idea behind the proximity fuse is simple to say and hard to build. Put a tiny radio inside the shell. As the shell flies, the little set sends out a signal and listens for its reflection. When the shell comes close to a target, the reflected signal jumps. That jump triggers the fuse, and the shell explodes right where its fragments are most deadly, close to the aircraft's skin, not yards away and not too late. In plain English, the shell chooses its own best moment to burst. Saying it is easy. Making it survive the real world is not. A naval gun launches a shell with a shock that would crush most machines. The fuse had to ride out tens of thousands of Gs at the instant of firing, withstand fierce spin as the shell rifled through the barrel, and then work perfectly when it reached the sky. If it failed too early, it could explode over your own ship. If it failed too late, it was worthless. If it failed at all, the secret might be recovered by the enemy. That is where the race begins. On one side, the battlefield's urgent need, fleets threatened by air attack, cities facing bombers, ground troops exposed to strafing and dive bombing. On the other side, a lab problem for the ages. Build a rugged, reliable, tiny radio with vacuum tube electronics, fit it into a steel nose, and make it foolproof. The task fell to a group of American scientists and engineers working in close partnership with the Navy's ordnance experts. Physicist Merle Tuve and the team often referred to as Section T helped lead the push. Their new home base quickly became the Applied Physics Laboratory, an organization created to turn theory into hardware at combat speed. Step by step, the team solved problems that looked impossible on paper. Vacuum tubes of the day were delicate glass devices. They shrank them, reinforced them, and sealed them in protective compounds so they would survive the launch shock. They designed a reserve battery that woke up only after firing, activation by setback forces, so the fuse would remain harmless during storage and loading. They built a safety chain that ensured the round would not arm until it had cleared the barrel and stabilized in flight. They tuned the radio circuit so that a moving shell could still hear the change in its own echo as it closed on a target. They chased stray vibrations, temperature swings, moisture, and corrosion. And then they did the hardest thing. They made all of that work not once in a laboratory, but again and again in mass production, on ships in salt spray, in heat and cold, with sailors' lives on the line. But a claim in a memo means nothing until the range proves it. The first proofs began at stateside test sites. Crews lofted targets beneath balloons and sent out pilotless drones to mimic enemy aircraft. Gunners fired with the new fuse and watched for the signature, a burst close to the target without a direct hit. When it happened, the effect was unmistakable. You could see the difference with your own eyes. The pattern of near misses turned into visible kills. Then came a milestone at sea. A brand new light cruiser, USS Cleveland, hosted shipboard trials in 1942. Drones roared across the firing arcs, and the 5-inch batteries spoke. The shells did not have to touch the targets. They only had to pass close, and when they did, they detonated, shredding the drones in air. For the officers watching through binoculars, the message was simple: this could work in a real fight. After that, production orders grew, training expanded, and the Navy began to seed VT ammunition into the places where the risk of enemy recovery was lowest. Over deep water, where a dud would sink beyond reach. Now picture the next scene far from any test range. Night sea, black shapes of islands on the horizon, the air thick and tense. It's the Solomons campaign, Guadalcanal, and the bitter naval battles that surrounded it. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes had already proved how dangerous they were to American ships. On a January day in 1943, a U.S. light cruiser, USS Helena, met an incoming attacker with 5-inch fire that carried the new Fuze. The shells burst close, not late, and the aircraft went down. It was one moment among thousands in the Pacific War, but to the sailors who saw it, it was a turning of the screw. Near misses were no longer wasted. What changed on deck after that? Confidence. Anti-aircraft crews still had to spot, track, and lead. They still had to fight against surprise, weather, and fatigue. But the Fuze took away one of the biggest uncertainties: the brutal guess about the perfect instant to burst. When planes jinked or dove, when speed and angle played tricks on the eye, VT gave the shell its own judgment. That meant more first-pass kills, fewer second runs, and a little more breathing space on ships that had felt helpless against a skilled attack. If the technology was that powerful, why not shout it from the rooftops and issue it everywhere at once? Because secrecy could keep men alive. If a round malfunctioned over land, the enemy might find the parts, learn the trick, and build a countermeasure. So policy kept VT out of most land fighting in 1943 and much of 1944. The code names helped hide it in plain sight. The Navy called it VT, short for variable time, a label that sounded like nothing more than a new way to set a time fuse. The Army used POSIT. Crates, manuals, and paperwork avoided the word radio. Sailors and soldiers trained on what it did, not why it did it. The rule was simple: use it where the odds of enemy recovery were low and where the payoff against aircraft was highest. Inside the labs and factories, the work moved just as quietly. If a round malfunctioned over land, the enemy might find the parts, learn the trick, and build a countermeasure. So policy kept VT out of most land fighting in 1943 and much of 1944. The code names helped hide it in plain sight. The Navy called it VT, short for variable time, a label that sounded like nothing more than a new way to set a time fuse. American industry learned to build the Fuze by the millions. Multiple companies made sub-assemblies, so the loss of one plant to accident or attack would not cripple the program. Quality control crews pulled samples and fired them routinely to catch flaws before they reached a magazine or a gun tub. Engineers listened to feedback from the fleet and kept improving reliability. The goal was not a clever gadget. The goal was something a 19-year-old gunner's mate could trust. For a moment, step back from the machines and watch the people who use them. Picture a gun director crew on a destroyer. The talker relays range and bearing. The pointer and trainer fight the motion of the ship. The hot smell of cordite drifts on the wind. When the order comes, commence firing. There isn't time to wonder whether a dial on a fuse setter was off by a quarter second. There is only time for the gun to do its job. VT gave those crews a tool that forgave small errors and punished sudden evasive moves by the enemy. It did not make the ship safe, but it made the ship deadlier. There is another reason this story matters. The proximity fuse is a lesson in wartime innovation without glamour. It isn't a new aircraft you can point to on a poster. It isn't a famous tank or a wonder bomb. It's a small, almost invisible change to an old weapon, the shell, that completely alters the odds. It shows how science and engineering can solve a practical problem under pressure. Choose the right instant to explode. It also shows how policy and secrecy shape technology. The Allies did not keep VT secret to hoard credit. They kept it secret to keep it working, to deny the enemy both the device and the time to respond. By the end of this first chapter in the story, the pieces are in place. The problem is clear. Near misses are wasteful against fast, agile threats. The concept is proven. a tiny radio that listens for its own echo and bursts at the lethal distance. The engineering is solved enough to fight. Rugged tubes, reserve batteries, safe arming, stable circuits. The tests at sea are convincing. The first combat kill has happened. The code names are in use. The fleet has a new kind of ammunition, and the enemy does not yet know exactly why their losses are rising. So where does this lead? To larger skies and larger stakes. As the war grinds on, new threats appear. Pilotless flying bombs racing toward cities, and later, waves of suicide aircraft hurled at ships. The question is whether this small device, born in labs, hardened in factories, proven in the Solomon Islands, can scale up to meet those crises. Can it thicken the belt of guns around a city until pilotless missiles fall short? Can it give sailors on the picket lines a fighting chance against coordinated, high-speed dives? Hear the buzz first, the hard insect hum of a V1 skimming in from the channel, then the sirens, then the guns. In the summer of 1944, London's fate depended on seconds and math. Could the defenders find a pilotless missile in the sky, aim where it would be, and burst shells at the one distance that mattered? And months later, on the far side of the world, could ships hold their nerve when real pilots turned themselves into weapons, diving straight through fire toward a flight deck? This is the story of how a tiny radio inside a shell, paired with radar and a brain in a box, helped tip both fights. Tonight we answer a simple question. Can one small fuse, used the right way, change the map of a city and the survival odds of a fleet? Listen to how Britain built its shield. Along the southeast coast, the Allies laid a belt of heavy anti-aircraft guns. Each battery had 3 pieces of kit that only worked their magic together. First, the SCR-584 radar, slewing fast, locking hard, tracking a V1 even as it jinked with wind or engine coughs. Second, the M9 predictor, an analog computer that took the radar's numbers and spat out where to aim and when to fire. Third, the VT fuse in the shell's nose, so the burst happened at the optimal distance from the target. Radar to see, predictor to decide, VT to kill. Week by week, results climbed from early stumbles to stunning success. By late August 1944, coastal guns were shooting down the majority of V1s that entered the belt. On one day, the rate hit the 80s. Shells per kill fell from thousands to about 100. The math of the defense had changed. Numbers tell only part of it. Tactics shifted too. Crews repositioned guns to create denser crossing fires. They raised barrage altitudes to catch missiles earlier. They learned not to waste ammunition at bad angles and saved rounds for the sweet spot where VT fragments did maximum work. Confidence rose with every black smoke burst that sent a buzz bomb down into the water before it reached London. Even senior commanders said it plainly after the war. Proximity fuses made those near-perfect days possible. Behind the scenes, there was a quiet, gritty kind of improvement you never see in newsreels. More guns arrived on the belt. Crews trained harder on the new radar and predictor. Procedures tightened so the handoff from search to fire was clean. Acquire with 584, compute with M9, load VT, fire fast, correct, fire again. This wasn't one silver bullet. It was a system built so each piece made the others better. The payoff was visible. Fewer warheads reaching the city, more falling short into fields, estuaries, and sea. Now fly 8,000 miles across the Pacific and fast forward to late 1944 and 1945. A new threat appears, deadly and human. Kamikaze pilots come in low or steep, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, using cloud, sun, and timing to rob defenders of seconds. Time fuses are guesswork against that kind of closure rate. Contact fuses are too late unless you score a direct hit. Here the VT fuse's gift, the right burst at the right distance, means everything. The 5-inch 38 guns throw a heavy shell with a wide, lethal fragment cloud. Fused by VT, a near miss can tear a suicide plane apart or batter it off aim. The point, though, is what gave you a chance when seconds were all you had. A fast director, trained crews, and shells that didn't need a perfect time setting to do their worst. In the ugliest rushes, where planes broke through the outer rings, that combination kept many decks alive. Watch how a typical defense worked on a carrier task group. Far out, fighters tried to thin the raid. Mid-ring, cruisers and battleships threw controlled 5-inch fire, radar tracking, predictors humming, VT shells bracketing the formation. In close, escorts and the carrier's own mounts added weight, and lighter guns filled the gaps. Whenever a kamikaze punched into that inner space, VT mattered most. Shells didn't have to touch. They only had to pass close enough to burst into the cockpit, the engine, the control surfaces, anything that could spoil the aim or end the dive. The Navy's wartime tallies later showed a telling split. Although VT rounds were a minority of 5-inch shells fired, they accounted for a majority of 5-inch kills. That is the edge a Fuze can give. There is a reason logistics officers and ordnance chiefs talked about priority resupply for VT. Fleet units most exposed, fast carriers, pickets, the ships riding shotgun for amphibious forces, needed those rounds first. Magazines tracked VT stocks like lifeblood. Captains knew exactly how many they had before operations. Handling rules were strict, training relentless. Keep the circuits dry, watch the safety chain, load smart under pressure. Reports from the field went back to the labs and factories, feeding small fixes that kept reliability high, even in salt, heat, and shock. The goal was simple and human. When a 19-year-old in a gun tub slammed a round home, it had to work. You can hear the difference VT made in the way sailors described near misses. Before, a miss was dead air and fear. With VT, bursts felt right, close, violent, tearing. Planes staggered, veered, or broke apart. Pilots who might have had one more second to correct now didn't. And when one attacker fell short or cartwheeled into the sea, the whole formation lost a little timing and nerve, buying the ship precious breathing space for the next run. That is how a marginal improvement in one shell turns into survival for hundreds of people. None of this erases the horror. The record of Okinawa is full of names of ships that still took hits. The defense was never perfect. It was probability moved in your favor. That movement came from a system: early warning, radar tracking, computing fire, and shells that burst where they should. Take away any one piece and the odds drop. Put them together and the sky tilts your way. Step back and look at the arc from London to Okinawa. In Britain, the V1 campaign forced a laboratory idea into a working architecture. Radar, predictor, VT. The numbers climbed and the city endured. In the Pacific, the same logic. Find, aim, burst at the right distance, met a very different enemy and still paid off. That is why historians rank the proximity Fuze alongside radar and code breaking as a quiet war winner. It did not make headlines every day, but it saved lives every day it was used. Hold that thought for the next chapter. We've seen VT turn back pilotless missiles and give ships a fighting chance against men who chose death as a tactic. But what happens when you take that same Fuze ashore, into snow-choked forests, where a shell can burst above an advancing column and rain steel through branches and onto roads? If VT could transform city belts and carrier screens, what will it do over the Ardennes, where the front is collapsing and every minute counts? Hear the winter first. Snow that swallows sound. Trees that creak like doors in an old house. Roads that turn to ice under boots and treads. In December 1944, the Ardennes became a white maze, and through that maze, the German offensive came fast. American lines bent. Bridges went missing. Radios crackled with bad news. In moments like this, armies look for anything that flips the odds. Something small, reliable, and immediate. The Allies had it, but they had kept it secret for years. Tonight we ask the question that haunted both sides in that winter. If a shell could choose the perfect instant to explode, could it stop an army in the trees? The green light came late. For most of the war, leaders feared that if a dud landed on dry ground, the enemy would pick it up, pry it open, and copy the secret. So the proximity Fuze, codenamed VT or POSIT, was kept mainly at sea and along coasts, where failures sank or fell into water. That changed after the V1 crisis and the capture of Antwerp. The Allies began allowing land use in limited ways during autumn 1944. When the German offensive erupted in mid-December, Eisenhower pressed for full clearance, and got it. Within days, restrictions dropped, and U.S. guns in the Ardennes began firing VT-fused shells in quantity. Contemporary accounts say roughly 200,000 such rounds were used during the battle. The risk calculus had flipped. The need was now. The payoff enormous. What happened next is simple to describe and terrifying to be under. Instead of hitting the ground and throwing fragments sideways, VT shells sensed the earth and the tree canopy and burst in the air, above road bends, assembly points, hedgerows, and forest tracks. Steel rain fell into shallow foxholes and open truck beds. Splinters came down through branches and onto helmets. German units that had trained to hug the ground against air and artillery discovered there was no safe down anymore. American spotters learned to walk fire over columns, not just in front or behind. Reports from the front spoke of confusion, shock, and sudden stalls where attacks had been gathering pace only minutes before. Commanders noticed. George S. Patton, never shy with a verdict, called it the funny Fuze and said flatly that it won the Battle of the Bulge for the Allies. You don't have to take that literally to grasp his meaning. In winter fighting where seconds mattered and concealment was everything, artillery that chose its own bursting height turned near misses into kills and movement into hesitation. VT didn't magically stop every push. It moved probability in our favor. In a battle decided by thin margins, that shift felt like a lever on fate. Why did the effect feel so immediate? Because airbursts attack the one thing field units can't armor, the top. Trenches and low walls shield you from side-thrown fragments. They do little against shards falling from above. In the Ardennes, where tree limbs could prime ordinary time fuses by accident, VT made the tree burst intentional and repeatable. Fire planners began to assume overhead bursts, not hope for them. The difference shows up in after-action notes. Fewer rounds to achieve suppression, quicker breaks in momentum, and more nights when the line held because the road ahead turned deadly in a minute. Behind that battlefield story sits a scale that's easy to miss. By war's end, American industry had built on the order of 22 million proximity fuses across more than 100 firms. Crosley, RCA, Sylvania, Eastman Kodak, and many others, while cost per fuse plunged from hundreds of dollars at the start to a few tens of dollars by 1945. Dahlgren's proving grounds flight-tested daily lot samples. Failures were traced and fixed before they could become tragedies at the front. When the Ardennes blew open, that quiet industrial machine meant the right rounds were already stacked in magazines and could be rushed to the guns that needed them most. It wasn't just quantity. The VT program forced new ways to build electronics. This was among the first truly mass-produced uses of printed wiring or printed circuits, thin conductors laid onto insulating substrates, because point-to-point wiring shook loose under launch shock. Centralab and others screen-printed silver inks on ceramic, baked them, and even printed resistors, shrinking and hardening the innards so they would survive the gun. That trickle of innovation turned into a post-war river. The same manufacturing logic shows up in the circuit boards that run everything from radios to missiles. Strip the fuse down, and the magic becomes a few elegant steps. In the nose sits a tiny oscillator, a little radio that uses the shell body as an antenna. As the shell flies, the oscillator's signal bounces off whatever is nearby. When something, ground, tree canopy, a vehicle, a man, comes close, the reflected wave mixes with the outgoing wave and makes a low beat in the circuit, a Doppler throb that grows as distance shrinks. Two small amplifier stages listen for that beat. When it crosses a threshold, a thyrotron, a gas-filled electronic switch, fires, dumping current into an electric detonator. A reserve battery that slept through storage wakes at launch under setback forces, so the fuse arms only after clearing the gun. Pack the tubes in wax and oil, mount the parts so shocks spread evenly, and you get a radio that survives tens of thousands of Gs and still works in freezing air. The principle is simple. The reliability under fire is the miracle. Once armies trusted that miracle, tactics changed. Artillery officers began to plan for overhead effects on demand, not as a lucky accident of time setting. Barrages that once chewed up empty ground started detonating where they hurt most, 5 to 15 meters above human beings. Night-harassing fire could pin roads without cratering them beyond use for your own advance. Quick smack missions against assembly areas did more with fewer rounds, easing strain on supply and guns. The same logic had already reshaped naval anti-aircraft doctrine. 5-inch batteries with VT became the backbone against kamikazes. And it would echo into the Cold War as new fuses sensed not just distance, but velocity and aspect, telling missiles when to burst for maximum fragment density against jets and warheads. If you want proof that VT had a long shadow, look at who worked on it and where they went. The small wartime group called Section T, under physicist Merle Tuve, became the seed of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Young scientists like James Van Allen cut their teeth hardening radios to survive gunfire. Van Allen later helped lead America into space and gave his name to the radiation belts around Earth. The same mind that once worried about a therotron's trigger delay was soon timing cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere. That is what an urgent, practical project can do. Build institutions and careers that last generations. Step back and tally the ledger. In Britain, VT helped turn a desperate defense against pilotless bombs into a system that worked. Radar to see, predictor to aim, fuse to kill. At sea, it gave ships a harder bite against suicide dives and fast, low attackers. In the Ardennes, it let artillery tear at the top of an army that counted on the cover of trees and darkness. Vannevar Bush, who ran America's wartime science effort, liked to name the few inventions that actually bent the war's curve. After radar and code breaking, he put the proximity fuse on that short list. You can argue rankings, you can't argue the pattern. A tiny radio, properly used, saved lives across 3 fronts. There's a more human way to say it. Picture a 19-year-old gunner in a snow-stiff parka, hands raw from handling metal in sub-freezing air. He doesn't care about oscillators, Doppler beats, or printed circuits. He cares that when the order comes, fire. The round he just shoved into the breech does its job. In that winter, over those roads and villages, the proximity fuse did. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough to matter in the hardest weeks of a long war. So our question from the start, could a shell that chooses its own instant to explode stop an army in the trees? Has an answer. It could stop enough of it. Enough trucks, enough half-tracks, enough men caught in the open to slow the rhythm of an offensive until reserves arrived and the weather turned. It could give Bastogne and the line around it just enough breathing space to turn disaster into an opportunity. It could make every column think twice about the next bend in a forest road. And then the war moved on, but the idea did not. After 1945, proximity and active fuse became normal, then smarter, then networked. Missiles carried seekers that not only sensed distance, but judged speed and angle. Artillery shells learned to burst in air without radar at all, using clever timing or laser rangefinding to mimic the same effect VT pioneered. The lineage is clear, and it starts with a design that fit into the palm of a hand and survived the punch of a 5-inch gun.